Distraction is proud to be sponsored by Omega Bright, the premier natural advanced omega-3 formula for mind, heart, and joint health. Hi, this is Dr. Ned Hallowell for Distraction. Fake news is not just reserved for politics. We are going to explore fake news in the name of science. It's always existed. What's new is social media's potential to spread this kind of information faster and to a wider audience. The complication with science news is that consumers need to decide if a story is bad science reporting, fake news, or something in between. At the extreme, some companies are using deceptive marketing techniques to trick people into buying wrinkle creams and diet pills. They create fake news websites and fake product endorsements. It's a funny world we're living in these days. Well, to help us with all of this, I'm very pleased to have join us Professor Kevin Elliott from Michigan State University.
Hey, it's super great to be able to talk with you.
Professor Elliott, if I can call you Kevin?
Of course.
Okay, well, tell us exactly, what do you profess?
Yeah. So I'm an associate professor of philosophy. My PhD was actually in the history and philosophy of science. And my current position is really a somewhat interdisciplinary one. I have joint appointments, first in a residential college within Michigan State University. So this particular residential college focuses on educating students in the sciences. And then I'm also partially appointed in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife because of my work in issues related to research ethics and environmental ethics and so on.
Well, that's wonderful, and I think in today's world, interdisciplinary is the way to go. So you're not constrained by boundaries. You're just looking for the truth. Give us some examples of how alternative facts in science have been used to help us think about a product or issue in a certain way, like tobacco, climate change, diets. You take your pick.
Yeah, well, so as you pointed out, tobacco actually is one of the examples that people will often go back to just because it was so striking and so significant that, back in the 1950s when the tobacco companies we're starting to realize there was significant evidence that, tobacco smoking was causing cancer. They started working with an influential public relations firm to develop a kind of a comprehensive strategy to, I think it's fair to say, mislead the public with alternative facts. And there's a wonderful book called Merchants of Doubt, actually, by a couple of historians, Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, where they point out that some of the same scientists and strategies and public relations firms that were involved in the tobacco case then used a lot of these same strategies to cast doubt on the evidence for acid rain and then the ozone hole and now climate change. So when we hear, our EPA director, questioning the connections between carbon dioxide emissions and climate change, this is just part of kind of a long-running strategy by a lot of these organizations to mislead and confuse the public.
Now, just help me with this, because anybody with half a brain, particularly with tobacco being so recent, knows that, alternative facts is just newspeak. That means lies. And so how are we being asked to swallow the lies around climate change? And what does it mean when the head of the EPA, he's the head of the EPA?
Yeah, Scott Pruitt.
Is stating a bold-faced lie.
Yeah, well, I think this is a great question. And part of it is the strategic moves of these organizations that they know if it's just the tobacco company telling us the alternative fact or the lie, or if it's like ExxonMobil directly telling us the lie, then we're not so likely to believe it. But they developed these approaches of heavily funding certain think tanks or front groups that would look like grassroots organizations doing lobbying on behalf of the public, but that was actually getting money from some of these organizations. And they would have, folks, either scientists or just sort of savvy people who could appear on news shows and so on and present these perspectives. And so, part of it is managing to get these other groups to give the message. And part of it, the media actually hasn't always served us so well. I think they're doing better now, but they fell into this trap of thinking that to be balanced, they had to present both sides of the story, even if nearly the entire scientific community, took one view and just a few sort of renegade scientists took another view. So that's been a problem.
It's sort of like presenting both sides of the Holocaust, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. Very well put.
Yeah. But how do you, pardon me for being cynical, but it seems to me that a huge chunk of the population is not interested in the truth. They don't want to hear from pointy-headed intellectuals. They want to be entertained by, sweeping controversial statements, and truth almost seems like a boring, who cares about that?
Yeah, well, so that may be, we may have to acknowledge different strategies working with different groups. So if you have people who are seriously wanting to seek the truth, well, then we may be able to sort of talk about the best sources for the best science. But you make a great point, and I think my sociologist colleagues would actually say that just trying to hit people over the head with scientific facts often isn't the most effective strategy, that we're very polarized, we're very influenced by our values.
Right.
And so we may also have to consider sort of not being deceptive, but how we present information.
So we no longer need to think about telling the truth. We have to think about marketing the truth.
Yeah, and this gets into a challenging issue where we cross the line. It's complicated.
It sure is. Well, help me and our listeners become more adept at the science of getting at the truth. So let's say we're reading a magazine or listening to the radio, and on comes one of the many ads trumpeting the virtue of the latest diet pill or diet regimen. How do we separate out whether it's worth going out and buying that product or not?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that we want to be sophisticated enough to recognize that one study about just about anything shouldn't be enough for us to think, oh, wow, this is the truth. I think that if we understand that science operates over an extended process, it's a social endeavor. Some scientists will develop a potential finding, and then others need to replicate the work. So I think that would be the first thing I would say is unless you've got money to spend and you think there's nothing to lose, don't go pursue something just because of one study. And the scientific community can also be taking steps. We may not have time to talk about it in this podcast, but there are a lot of efforts to improve reproducibility among scientists as a whole, not just those working with sneaky interest groups. So I think there's a lot to be said about that too.
How often does it come down to simply who does the best job of marketing or of persuading? I mean, it seems to me it takes a terribly discriminating consumer to leaf through the scientific literature. I dare say almost nobody does that. And instead they respond to being scared by somebody saying, this vaccine will cause autism. And so they say, well, darn it, I won't let him get vaccinated.
Right. Yeah, I think that you're right. It does take an incredibly discriminating person. And, most of us aren't qualified, even if, we are scientists, or like myself as a philosopher of science, looking at scientific methodology outside a particular field. We don't have the expertise to identify the subtle sort of judgment calls being made in the research that, may make it better or worse science. And so we really do depend on, first, the community of scientists in that area to evaluate each other's work. And then second, the responsible media to help distill this perspective of the scientific community for us.
Well, you're in a very timely, interesting field, and it's becoming ever more relevant and important. And as we live in this age of information saturation, separating out the truth from the the fake becomes a daily task for all of us. And thank you, Professor Kevin Elliott, for offering such useful guidance.
Well, it's wonderful talking with you. And maybe I can just sort of highlight, as you put it so nicely there, this is a task for even our public education system that I think it's becoming all the more important for us as citizens to, throughout our education, learn how to distinguish reliable information from that which isn't, as we've got all this information pouring at us. So I think you put that well.
Yeah, and when in doubt, don't believe it. At least until you get some more evidence.
That's right.
All right. Thanks a million, and thank you so much for joining us on Distraction.
Thank you so much for having me.
Remember to check out our sponsor, Omega Bright. Go to omegabright.com, a 100% natural and advanced omega-3 formula. Call 1-800-383-2030. That's 1-800-383-2030. Or go to distractionpodcast.com and click on the Omega Bright logo, or go directly to Omega Bright's site and order the product. It is a life saver, life extender, life enhancer for sure. Distraction is produced by Collisions, the podcast division of CRN International. Collisions, podcasts for curious people. Our producer is Sarah Gurton, our sound engineer is Scott Person, and our music was created by Mark Berman.